In this episode, we move from proving identity to controlling what that identity is allowed to do, because authorization is where security becomes practical and where mistakes quietly become long-term risk. Authentication answers the question of who you are, but authorization answers the question of what you can access and what actions you can take once you are inside. When you are new to cybersecurity, it is easy to imagine authorization as a simple on or off decision. Yet real environments need structured models that grant the right access for real work without letting permissions balloon over time. That ballooning is privilege creep, and it happens when people accumulate access through role changes, temporary projects, quick fixes, and forgotten exceptions that never get unwound. By the end of this discussion, you should understand what an authorization model is, how to align it with business reality, and how to keep it from drifting into overly broad access that becomes difficult to defend. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. An authorization model is the organized method an organization uses to decide which identities can access which resources under which conditions, and it is best understood as a mapping between work responsibilities and permissions. The model matters because ad hoc access decisions create inconsistency, and inconsistency creates confusion, and confusion creates security gaps that nobody sees until an incident or audit forces the truth into the open. A healthy authorization model provides repeatability, meaning two people doing the same job should have access that looks largely the same, and it provides traceability, meaning you can explain why access exists and who approved it. It also provides a way to change access safely when the business changes, because businesses always change, and security programs that pretend otherwise eventually collapse under exceptions. On the exam, when you see questions about improving access control, the best answers typically introduce structure and accountability rather than adding more one-off approvals. To build an authorization model that matches real work, you first need to understand what real work actually looks like, because job titles do not always reflect day-to-day responsibilities. People often wear multiple hats, teams collaborate across boundaries, and special projects temporarily change who needs access to what. If you design access purely from an org chart, you end up with models that either block work or grant overly broad permissions to avoid blocking work. A better approach is to identify common work patterns and the systems those patterns require, then define roles or access packages that align with those patterns. This does not mean you must capture every unique situation in advance, but it does mean your model should cover the majority of normal work so that exceptions are truly exceptions rather than the default. On the exam, scenarios that describe constant exceptions or widespread shared access usually point to a model that does not reflect real workflows. Role-based access is a common foundation for authorization models because roles provide a stable way to bundle permissions around job functions. The key is that a role should represent a set of responsibilities, not a person, and the role should be defined in a way that makes access decisions repeatable. When roles are well-defined, onboarding becomes easier, audits become clearer, and changes can be handled by moving someone between roles rather than manually editing dozens of permissions. When roles are poorly defined, they become dumping grounds for access requests, and privilege creep accelerates because roles only expand and never contract. A strong role model requires discipline in role creation, role naming, and role scope, because too many roles become unmanageable, but roles that are too broad become unsafe. On the exam, the strongest reasoning often favors a manageable role structure with clear boundaries and review rather than extreme complexity or extreme simplicity. Attribute-based access is another approach that can complement roles by making access decisions based on characteristics of the user, the resource, and the context. Attributes might include department, location, clearance level, device trust, or time of access, and the idea is that access is granted when the attributes satisfy defined rules. This approach can better match real work in environments where roles alone cannot capture complexity, such as when access depends on project membership or data sensitivity classification. The important concept for beginners is not memorizing terminology, but understanding that authorization can consider context and conditions rather than being purely static. Contextual authorization helps reduce privilege creep because access can be constrained to the situations where it is needed instead of being granted permanently. On the exam, when you see scenarios that involve conditional access requirements, solutions that incorporate context often align with modern control expectations. The biggest enemy of a good authorization model is privilege creep, and privilege creep is best understood as a process failure rather than as a single mistake. Privilege creep happens when access is granted for a good reason in the moment, but the reason expires while the access remains. It also happens when people change jobs and keep old permissions because nobody wants to risk breaking something. Over time, individuals accumulate privileges across systems, and the organization loses the ability to say with confidence that access matches responsibilities. This is dangerous because it increases the impact of account compromise and increases the likelihood of accidental misuse, such as someone accessing data they should not see simply because they can. On the exam, questions that describe excessive access or unclear justification often require you to identify privilege creep and propose controls that prevent or reverse it. Preventing privilege creep starts with designing access to be time-bound or review-bound when the access is not part of normal role duties. Project access, emergency access, and temporary elevated privileges should have built-in expiration and require renewal through approval if still needed. This approach shifts access from permanent accumulation to deliberate renewal, which forces the organization to periodically restate the business justification. It also makes offboarding and role transitions easier because fewer permissions are indefinite. Another preventive measure is ensuring that role changes trigger access reassessment, so that moving to a new role automatically removes old role-based access and adds new role-based access, rather than simply adding more. On the exam, when asked how to reduce excessive permissions, answers that include time limits, triggers, and periodic review generally reflect stronger lifecycle discipline. A practical authorization model must also handle exceptions without letting exceptions become the main way access is granted. Exceptions are sometimes necessary because real work includes edge cases, but exceptions must be governed with the same seriousness as baseline access. That means documented justification, approval by the right authority, defined scope, and a review timeline. Exceptions should be tracked and measured, because rising exception volume often signals that your model does not match real work or that your roles are too restrictive. When exceptions are unmanaged, they become invisible permissions that persist indefinitely, which is privilege creep in disguise. On the exam, mature answers usually include structured exception governance and feedback loops to improve the model rather than relying on informal approvals. Authorization models depend heavily on group and permission hygiene, because permissions are often implemented through groups, roles, or access bundles that grant rights across many systems. If groups are created casually, if memberships are not reviewed, or if the purpose of a group is unclear, then the authorization model becomes messy even if the intent was good. Good hygiene means each group has a clear purpose. Each group maps to a role or access package. Membership changes are controlled, and groups are reviewed periodically for scope and membership accuracy. This is where documentation matters, because you cannot defend access if you cannot explain what a permission bundle is meant to do. On the exam, answers that emphasize clear group definitions, controlled membership, and review usually align with the control objective of maintaining predictable authorization. Separation of duties is another concept that strengthens authorization models by preventing risky combinations of permissions from being held by one identity. Some actions are dangerous when combined, such as the ability to create a vendor and approve payments, or the ability to deploy code and approve changes without oversight. Separation of duties reduces the risk of fraud and reduces the impact of account compromise because an attacker cannot complete a full chain of high-risk actions with one set of credentials. This does not mean every organization can implement perfect separation everywhere, but it does mean the authorization model should identify high-risk combinations and prevent or monitor them closely. On the exam, scenarios involving abuse of combined privileges often point to missing separation of duties rather than a lack of authentication strength. Monitoring and logging also support authorization integrity, because the model is only trustworthy if misuse or drift can be detected. Authorization decisions should generate evidence of who has access and when access changes occur, and usage monitoring can reveal access that is technically granted but never legitimately used. Unused access is often a candidate for removal because it represents risk without benefit. Monitoring can also reveal unusual access patterns, such as a user accessing systems outside their role or repeatedly attempting restricted actions, which might indicate misprovisioning or compromise. On the exam, when asked how to validate whether access aligns with work needs, answers that combine review with usage evidence tend to reflect mature reasoning. Metrics and reporting help keep authorization models aligned with real work over time because they reveal whether the model is stable or drifting. Useful measures include the number of exception requests, the percentage of users with elevated permissions, the frequency of role changes without access review, and the amount of dormant access that persists beyond a defined period. These indicators help governance teams identify where privilege creep is forming and where model adjustments are needed. Reporting also supports leadership decisions because it translates access control health into risk language, such as reducing the number of accounts with broad access or shortening the duration of elevated privileges. On the exam, mature governance is often signaled by the presence of measurable oversight and corrective action rather than by static rule statements. To conclude, building authorization models that match real work requires balancing structure with reality, so access is consistent, defensible, and adaptable without becoming overly permissive. Strong models map responsibilities to roles or conditional rules, use controlled groups and access bundles, and include separation of duties for high-risk combinations of privilege. Privilege creep is prevented through time-bounded access, role change triggers, periodic review, and governed exceptions that do not become permanent loopholes. When you can describe authorization in this way, you are demonstrating the controls mindset the exam expects, because you are treating access as a living system that must match business needs while remaining constrained, measurable, and reviewable over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.